A rather unlikely bromance. In the Oval Office, the President promises Starmer a very good trade deal. But what exactly does that mean? In his piece in Ukraine, closer tonight. Good evening. This is Newsnight, brought to you every weeknight from Broadcasting House with the best insights and interviews on a momentous day for the still apparently special relationship. Keir Starmer still in the DC area tonight, visiting a drone and defence manufacturer after his first visit to the White House as Prime Minister to Donald Trump. To react, we have our top panel, Anthony L. Gardner, who was Barack Obama's ambassador to the EU, foreign policy expert Sophia Gaston of the ASPI think tank and King's College London, and the satirist, writer, director and producer Armando Iannucci. And in Washington, Diana Furchtgott-Roth, the veteran of the first Trump administration. Nick is here as per usual. First, here's what happened today.
We've also always been there backing each other up.
Could you take on Russia by yourselves?
Well,
you know it looks so good tonight.
So this is a letter from His Majesty the King. It's an invitation for a second state visit. This is really special. This has never happened before. This is unprecedented.
Sing la 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 la.
Number one ally on each side. And we have good, France and Australia, we have a lot of good ones. But we've had a long-time relationship, a long time, hundreds of years.
We also know that there have been infringements on free speech. That is something that we'll talk about today at lunch.
We've had free speech for a very, very long time in the United Kingdom, and it will last for a very, very long time.
Mr. President, do you still think that Mr. Zelensky is a dictator?
Did I say that? I can't believe I said that. Next question.
You mentioned Canada. I think you're trying to find a divide between us that doesn't exist. We're the closest of nations, and we had very good discussions today, but we didn't discuss Canada.
Thank you.
Did our Prime Minister persuade you not to put tariffs on the UK?
He tried. He was working hard, I'll tell you that. He earned whatever the hell they pay him over there.
Well, first up, Nick is here as ever. Quite something, all that. Not just the optics of two chalk and cheese leaders, but some substance.
Well, Faisal, I have to say the mood in the Downing Street team right now is absolutely ecstatic. Chatting to people who are, in the words of the Hamilton song, in the room where it happened, I'm hearing things like game, set and match, and away from the cameras Donald Trump was saying nice things to them, talking about all the preparation. One person said to me it was like running a general election campaign all over again. Chatting also three big wins they're talking about. Firstly, that this cemented the personal relationship between Keir Starmer and Donald Trump, talking about how Donald Trump, they believe, made a commitment to NATO and to Article 5, and talking, as you were saying, about how trade talks are starting. Interestingly, one Labour backbencher who's not a stormtrooper said to me, Keir absolutely nailed it. This was his best moment as Prime Minister. So just look at those optics. They just could not have been better. As we saw from that film, President Trump delighted with that second state visit to the UK, unprecedented according to Keir Starmer. President Trump hailing Keir Starmer as a tough negotiator, no higher compliment from this president. And then, as we saw there, the Prime Minister had a Macron moment as he rebuked the Vice President on free speech. But let's just look at the substance. One big plus, as you were saying, President Trump talking about trade talks starting. If they happen, if they succeed, we won't need tariffs. It won't be a full trade deal. It's more what Peter Mandelson's been talking about, tech stuff. It's clicks and portals, but one score draw. So on Ukraine, President Trump praising the UK, France and other European countries for talking about that reassurance force in Ukraine if there is a peace deal to look after, but no firm commitment from President Trump on what we really want, that US backstop to help them as they deliver that security guarantee. But look, we're talking about a possible trade deal. I think what we need is there an economist in the House who could enlighten us on that? I think I spot one over there.
Well, yes. The interesting thing about was that the Prime Minister called it an economic deal. So it's not, as you said, not the full, fat, free trade agreement that was the subject of so much debate in the Brexit years. But in the context of the President applying tariffs all over the place, it would be a win not to have them. I think there will be a difficult political quid pro quo here, even, get my Latin right, and it was quite key that the role of JD Vance here, this is all about technology and what they do with, for example, the Digital Services Tax, what they do with the Online Harms Act, which I think that was what JD Vance was pointing towards when he said UK laws were affecting American tech companies. That's going to be pretty interesting. Are they willing to change them or give them up in some way in order to avoid tariffs? And if there are tariffs in all the other directions, the UK will still be indirectly affected. There was, though, an unexpected, intervention or non-intervention on the Chagos deal.
Well, a pretty clear win there, as Donald Trump indicated, as he said, he is inclined to go along with the new planned deal on the Chagos Island. He did say it would be a 140-year lease from Mauritius. It's currently planned to be 99 years, and he would need to see the detail. But it's quite interesting. On the eve of President Trump's inauguration, I was speaking to a senior member of the cabinet, and this person made 3 predictions to me. Firstly, that Keir Starmer would be in the White House within about a month of the inauguration. That happened. Secondly, Peter Mandelson would be approved as ambassador. That happened. And thirdly, that the Chagos deal would not be blocked. That happened. Now, there were interestingly elements from the Conservative Party and from Reform UK who said that those 3 things either wouldn't happen or would be blocked by the White House. Those 3 predictions appear from the Conservative and Reform UK elements of those parties to have gone up in a bit of DC puff of smoke.
Right, Anthony, surprisingly smooth. What do you make of this talk of a trade deal?
No, well, look, the Prime Minister put in a very solid performance, and he came to Washington with a pretty strong hand, talking about how the UK is spending more on defence than Europe. The fact that the UK is not part of the EU is already a good start because the President hates the EU and said publicly the EU is set up to screw the United States, which is, of course, absurd. So he came with a pretty good hand, played it well. I think the idea of presenting that invitation from King Charles was brilliant, and President Trump ate it up. Now, today's today. Tomorrow is tomorrow. We'll see what happens tomorrow. The problem is this president may well decide to ask the UK, are you with us or are you with them, the EU? You got to choose. Can't be both. So he's straddling a divide which today is pretty small, but it's going to widen. So I don't want to be negative. I think it was a good performance.
Well, it was a performance, though, wasn't it? It's easy now to game Trump when you're dealing with him one-to-one, which is to flatter him and to make the conversation about him. I mean, John Bolton, his ex-security advisor, said that's the only way you could get anything done. Go in and say nice things about him, which you saw Keir Starmer was doing. He did it, and he did it very well, but it's unsettling to watch because that seems to be the only way to get anything out of Trump. And then the other question is, yes, what happens tomorrow? Because Trump one day will say, Zelensky's a dictator. The next day will say, I'm not sure I said that at all. Yeah, well, extraordinary. So what's he going to say tomorrow?
Let's bring Diana in about your take on the trade tariffs with the UK, Diana. UK spared tariffs?
Well, I think it went very well. I think that President Trump very much appreciated the invitation, not just to the UK and the state visit, but to Balmoral, to King Charles's home. So he appreciated that, and therefore he said that he was going to go easy on the tariffs. Keir Starmer came looking for security. He wanted backup for British troops in Ukraine. He wanted an end to the fighting. He wanted a trade deal. He didn't want tariffs, and I think that he's got a lot of that. And he even got approval of the Chagos Islands, and I was very surprised about that. I didn't think that was going to happen.
OK, so Sophia, let's bring you in. A kind of a united front of sorts on Ukraine, but divide and rule on trade within Europe?
Oh, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I certainly don't think we have a united front with the United States on Ukraine yet. I think Trump certainly feels that we're still at early stage of the negotiations, and that's why he's keeping some of his cards to his chest. And I think certainly he regards this security backstop as something that he wants in the mix of negotiations. And he's also thinking very much about the Russians, because remember, he is regarding them as a negotiation party here. We certainly don't expend much thought as to what the Russians might want or wish to do, because of course we regard them quite rightly as the just profound villains in this story. But Trump takes a more nuanced view, and I think for him, he wants to somehow construct a deal which he can perceive to be a win for all sides. Now, whether or not that is actually possible, and of course, poor Ukraine, whose territory we're carving up here is hardly going to see that as a win, but I think he still thinks it's all to play for.
Well, we'll come back to minerals deal in a moment, but he did acknowledge, for example, that as much Ukraine territory should be returned from Russia. I think that was the first time he said that. These are low bars, aren't they? But also he said that Zelensky, or he seemed to suggest Zelensky wasn't a dictator, as Anthony said, and he reaffirmed his commitment to Article 5. Do you count those as wins?
These were definitely wins. These warm words were a departure. And I think we have to remember with Trump that, everything is a negotiation. Everything is up for discussion. He can be persuaded. He can be moved. Zelensky had clearly irritated him by rejecting his initial proposal around minerals. And of course, then some of the statements that he made in public. I think then Zelensky has been extremely successful over recent days in actually rolling things back, bringing things to a better place, negotiating well with Trump. And also, of course, he's been backed by his European allies, including Britain, who has been a very important messenger on this.
Yeah.
Let's just on the trade deal, if I may.
Yeah.
Because this is not the first time we have heard about a big, beautiful trade deal between the US and the UK. I remember when Boris Johnson said, we've got this beautiful oven-ready deal. It didn't happen for a good reason. These are tough things to actually bring to fruition. I've been involved in a few myself. So a full FTA involving agriculture, public procurement, health services, I doubt it. On tech and security, perhaps.
And you think they'll ask for the quid pro quo on things like the digital services tax, on the online arms?
They probably will. They probably will. I mean, I hope the UK will stand firm as a sovereign country that should hold firm to its legislation. But one point, it's true. The UK is less exposed than the European Union for one fundamental reason. It's a services-based economy, less than an economy based on the sale of industrial goods. However, the UK also, not being in the EU tent now, has a smaller shield and a smaller sword to retaliate. But I don't think it will be hit by tariffs. Today is a good sign in that direction.
Well, things like AI has had to make concessions to put a sort of dividing line between itself and Europe, and more in the Trump camp. It's had to say that, it didn't sign up to statements on diversity and regulation and so on. So it's much more, they're having to kind of swallow the American pill as opposed to the European pill.
Yes, well, this is interesting. Do you think, Sophia, well, anyone really, do you think that they may start to notice, the Europeans, we're trying to do a Brexit reset with Europe at the same time, these guys are getting rather close to Trump, who's currently attacking the European Union?
I think Trump is actually fairly pragmatic on this point. I think at some point they're going to realize that if you're asking Europe to do more on its own, that also means, Britain will have to cooperate with Europe more. And so there will have to be a balance struck. And in many respects, Trump does respect the sovereignty and nations acting in their own defined self-interest, as long as they're doing so with confidence. So I think he will, there will obviously be tension points and friction points.
But it's the people around Trump, like Vance, who don't see that, who don't have any qualms about telling various countries what to do in terms of how they run elections, or who they arrest, or who they let go, or how they work their freedom of speech.
We should expect
it's that sort of level of interference that is part of the norm now from
They will
Trump.
continue to interfere, and they will continue to tell us what to do. The question really is, does it matter? Will they ultimately push ultimatums? And I am actually a little optimistic that we might be able to chart the right course.
And should I just add an element of qualification that they're very happy in Downing Street, but the Emmanuel Macron meeting went well, and then a few hours later in New York, the United States tabled a UN Security Council resolution, which we didn't vote for, neither did France, but Russia and China did, and it didn't guarantee the sovereignty of Ukraine, and it didn't depict Russia as the aggressor. And there is potentially a big problem on this idea of UK and other European troops as a reassurance force. Donald Trump said Putin's fine with that. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said absolutely no way. And on this idea, this UK-French idea of having this American backstop, which is no American security in Ukraine, but it's above Ukraine, satellites, Air Force and US troops around Ukraine and firepower around Ukraine, we are not getting a definitive yes from President Trump on that.
Just let me bring in Diana.
On the other hand, there are the critical minerals. There are the critical minerals which the United States does want to protect. And also, President Trump feels very differently about the EU, especially since the EU keeps on coming out with these new taxes against American companies, looking at Google and Apple as its own personal piggy bank. So that very much annoys President Trump, and he feels differently towards Britain.
And so you think Britain can take advantage, essentially, of not being in the EU?
Absolutely, yes, yes.
But can I just make a point about these? The President Trump's view of US security in Ukraine, if there's a peace deal, is people working in mines, US business people, US engineers. The UK and the French view is when you are going up against President Putin, you probably need a little more firepower than some miners and some engineers.
What's important for me in the critical minerals deal is not the numbers, because the numbers are made up. Yeah. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of investment to get
the numbers
stuff out of the ground.
$500 billion. That's more than the Germans paid after Versailles.
But it doesn't matter. The perception that Trump has, which is a big step forward, is that the U.S. has a stake in a country that exists and is a sovereign country named Ukraine. Right. And we're going to find out what the final deal is. The first...
It's an extraordinary thing, though, Anthony, because these rare earths might not really exist. And the debt is not $350 billion. Everyone's dancing around this diplomatic dance based on something built on sand.
That's quite good for Zelensky, then, if they don't exist. He's getting a good deal, then, if he's getting that payment and they're not there.
They do exist, do they?
But we have no idea to what extent.
Diana, come in.
One reason the Russians wanted to invade was because of these critical minerals and all the huge resources that Ukraine has.
Okay.
So they're definitely there.
We'll come to the end of this, but I want to bring you in on the. We didn't quite get a sort of Hugh Grant Macron moment there, but he did interject over
J.D. Vance.
Over J.D. Vance's accusations on freedom of speech.
Yes, I mean...
What did you make of the Prime Minister's body language?
Starmer is picking his fights, isn't he? He's not going to fight with Trump because he knows that just backfires and, you know, you mustn't poke the bear. But it's fine to, you know, I think Trump enjoys seeing other people be given a hard time. He enjoys that. It's part of his sport.
No, it did. Do you think that was practiced, Nick?
Well, my understanding is that, well, as I quoted that person, is that they prepared for it like a general election campaign.
I'm sure they gamed it,
Yes, absolutely.
Well, let's leave that there for now. But as Keir Starmer was arriving at the White House, to the minute almost, Andrew Tate and his brother Tristan landed in Florida, having left Romania on a private jet. Despite being investigated over rape and human trafficking charges. The Tate brothers deny all the allegations against them. Romanian authorities expect the brothers to return as judicial proceedings complete. There's also a criminal investigation and a civil claim in the UK, and we'll talk to the lawyer for 4 alleged British victims in a moment. But here's what one, who we called Evie, told Victoria on Newsnight in 2023. The conversation is frank, contains strong language and refers to claims of sexual violence.
We went to my room to have sex, and whilst we were having sex, he put his hand on my throat and strangled me until I lost consciousness. And then when I kind of came back around, it was a bit confusing at first because you don't really know what's happened when you kind of pass out. But he was still having sex with me when I kind of came back around again.
And forgive the intrusive nature of these questions, but when you began having sex, you had consented. You were okay
Yes.
with that?
Yeah.
When you say you came round, are you saying that he was still penetrating you?
He was, yeah. I think as soon as the person you're having sex with is unable to communicate what they want to do, then that consent is just completely gone.
When you say you came round, what were you thinking?
Confusion to start off with, and then when I kind of I realised what had happened, I was quite scared really, because after that had happened, kind of we didn't have sex again after that. But he kind of kept saying, I own you, you belong to me, like threatening to kill me. And he ended up, he stayed the night and left in the morning. And then the next day, one of the whites of my eyes had gone completely red. Apparently, that's kind of common in domestic abuse cases where there's a lack of oxygen in your brain. So your blood vessels like start bursting to kind of try and get the oxygen there.
Did you feel that something had happened that was wrong?
I think I knew it was wrong, but I didn't think that the severity of it was as bad as I now think it is.
I'm guessing it didn't cross your mind to ever think about contacting the police?
No.
And why was that?
Again, like I said, I just didn't see it as being a really serious incident as it is.
When did you come across him again?
I would say properly would be in 2020 when he sort of started to get quite famous on TikTok. That was when his videos would like show up on my feed and on Instagram quite a lot as well.
What were you thinking about his success?
It's really disappointing. I think particularly kind of like knowing what he's done to me and the views that he shares, and kind of he's putting into like young men and young women's heads as well. It's just a shame that someone can get so famous from so much hatred.
At what point did you think that what you say happened to you, what you say he did to you, was wrong?
When in lockdown, when again on TikTok he became famous, I remember like sitting down with a few of my girl mates saying, oh, this is the guy, that's him. And they were like, God, that is awful. Like, because I have had friends that have been kind of sexually assaulted before, and my friend was like, you do realise that is what has happened to you, that is sexual assault. But I never really thought of it like that before, really.
Some people might say you have come forward because he is high profile now, because he is wealthy now, and it could possibly be financially advantageous to you. What would you say to them?
I'm not doing it for the money. I'm just doing it purely for two reasons. One is just to kind of make awareness of what he's like and hopefully get some justice. And the second reason is kind of education and consent. Hopefully can teach, women what that looks like and what that means, and encourage more women to come forward with stories.
And joining me now is Matthew Jury, who's the lawyer for Evie and 3 other alleged victims. What do you make of the Tate's arrival in the US?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that the man that the Trump administration is championing is the man who's alleged to have done those things you've just heard from that brave victim. I think it's just absolutely obscene that the Trump administration has interfered and intervened in this way in allowing the Tates to leave Romania and essentially find safe haven in the US. I'm only heartened by Governor DeSantis' reaction today in Florida that they're not welcome in his state, and he's asked his Attorney General to look at taking measures to, in his words, rebuff them.
Okay, so we're not, the Romanian legal system allowed them to leave.
Yes.
And we're not entirely sure exactly what the level of any interaction might have been between Trump administration officials and the Romanian officials.
Well, I think
there's a report of something.
I think that's minimising it somewhat, if I may say, Faisal.
Yeah.
I mean, look, we know, and it's been admitted and reported, that the Trump administration raised the matter of the Tates only last week. And we also have reports that the raising of that issue was done in such a way as it was made very clear what the Trump administration wanted. Now, we don't know precisely what levers were pulled, but we know that those levers were indeed pulled, and that this week the Tates, who are alleged to be some of the world's most prolific human traffickers and serial rapists, have now fled to the US and evaded justice.
What do the alleged victims that you represent, what do they say about the situation?
Well, they're distraught, they're dismayed, they're traumatised. To have the so-called leader of the free world in the corner of the man they allege is their abuser is deeply distressing.
Yeah, and he said, and he was asked about this in the Oval Office with Keir Starmer next to him, he said he knows nothing about it. What's your response to that?
Nonsense. I mean, well, if he doesn't know anything about it, then he's got no control over his officials, and I'm not sure what's worse.
Keir Starmer also commented, he said, there's an English element here, so it's important justice be done. Human trafficking is obviously, to my mind, a security risk. We will catch up with the story in due course. Is that the right way to frame this discussion with President Trump?
Look, you know, of course, there is the art of diplomacy, but there is an obligation, Keir Starmer has an obligation, the British government has an obligation, as do its authorities, to represent the interests of the British women who are alleged victims of Andrew Tate, and to ensure that he's extradited to this country to face prosecution. And I'm heartened, before I came on here, to read just now that Yvette Cooper is apparently, the Home Secretary, is now considering whether that extradition request can be made and done so imminently.
To the US now?
From the US to the UK.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what do you make of the suggestion that they'll return to Romania?
I think it's fanciful. And I think if they do return to Romania, it will be with assurances that the prosecution's going nowhere. I don't think there's any chance that the Tates would travel to Romania willingly if there was a chance of them being incarcerated.
Okay. And what's your theory on what's underpinning this then? I mean, it seems an extraordinary thing that they've turned up in America, in Florida, and where they might go in Florida. What do you think's happening here?
Well, I think Trump's made the calculation, or his officials and those around him have made the calculation, that Tate is popular with their base. But what I think they've miscalculated is the number of Republican voters and MAGA voters who find this absolutely disgusting, that the Trump administration would side with alleged human traffickers and rapists.
OK, well, Matthew Jury, we might leave that there. Thanks very much for bringing us up to date on
Thank you.
that. Thank you. And if you've been affected by the issues in tonight's programme, you can contact the BBC's Action Line on 0800 077 077 and by visiting bbc.co.uk/Action Line. And I'm back now with the panel. I mean, it was an extraordinary split-screen moment to see them arriving at exactly the same time as the Prime Minister was arriving.
I kind of think there are two Trump administrations, really. There's Trump and, you know, what occupies him on a day-by-day basis, an hour by an hour basis, and then those officials around him and the Musks of this world who've just been left to acquire their own power and influence. You know, it's no coincidence that Musk has been making all these advocacies of people like Tommy Robinson here and putting Tate back on X and you know, promoting white male rights over other rights.
Diana, hopefully you're still with us. What do you think might happen to the Tates under President Trump?
Well, I think what has to be made clear is that they are American citizens, because I understand that their father was American. So they do have a right to return to the States. And this is something that President Trump would not necessarily have heard about. If a US citizen outside the country wants to return, that individual has the right to return, and we saw that during COVID when a lot of the travel was stopped. And then judicial proceedings can continue in the United States, but they're allowed to return to have those judicial proceedings here in their home country. And they're evaluated here, and then there's the extradition requests, and they continue. But they do have the right to return, and it wasn't as though President Trump did anything particular to bend the law to allow them to return.
OK, thanks for that, Diana. Let's take a quick look now at a few of the stories on the front pages. No surprises, I imagine, at what it does make the front pages. We have the, let me just try and get that open, the FT. Trump dashes hopes over US cover for European peacekeepers in Ukraine. The Daily Mail, what an unlikely bromance. I've heard that headline before. The Guardian, Trump, US workers in Ukraine would be a security backstop. That was the argument we heard Anthony explaining. And of course, a reference there to the death of Gene Hackman. And the Sun special delivery, PM's White House summit, hands over King's invite. Don says yes and backs UK. Armando, I mean, you wrote satire about, precisely these sorts of meetings, but you've been put out of business now. I mean, a lot of things put you out of business, haven't they?
I speculate on what's going to happen in the future rather than what's happening now. I mean, if Trump said, did I say that Zelensky was a dictator? I forget. He will then argue for another term in office, and when people say, but you've had 2 terms, he'll say, no, I haven't. Yeah. No, I haven't. He'll say, no, you won 8 years ago. And he'll say, no, that didn't happen. That's fake news. Yeah, that's what he'll do.
And we're here saying that on the narrow confines of today, it seems to have been a success. But I mean, I remember being there when Theresa May visited Trump. And within 20 minutes, it was the deeply controversial policy, the so-called Muslim ban was announced. And so this, in tying himself so closely to President Trump, are there risks for Prime Minister Starmer?
Well, look, today was a good day, but the bigger point, which you're suggesting, is that a lot of the policies this administration is proposing are inimical to the UK's interests, whether it's climate change or whether it's Ukraine, we'll see about that, or more importantly, even the destruction of what's called a multilateral system, a rules-based order, whether it's trade or other institutions like that. The UK believes in all of these things, right? So it is really problematic for the UK to have a president of the White House saying, actually, we're going to go back to the spheres of influence, 19th century, where might makes right. Why? Because the United States actually get away with it.
OK, Sophia, last word to you on that.
This Trump administration is going to require an enormous diplomatic investment from us. And it's really interesting, if you talk to people in government, it's quite clear that the US relationship is still being handled as a very sensitive subject. So it's still being just a few people looking after these big, big decisions. Thanks for unpicking every angle on that to the panel. Thanks to Diana over in DC too. That's it for tonight. Nick's in the chair tomorrow, in this chair. Till then, have a very good night.